All right. This is the Fresh Start Project, where we explore the growing loss of trust in social institutions and how we can break free from broken systems and move forward towards something better. I'm Christian Mislowick, and with me today is Kimberly Ells. Kimberly is a policy advisor for Family Watch International, where she works to protect children from early sexualization and to promote the family as the fundamental unit of society. She is the author of The Invincible Family: Why the Global Campaign to Crush Motherhood and Fatherhood Can't Win. And she is a wife and mother of 5 children. Kimberly, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation, Christian. It's nice to be with you.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about your book and get into this global campaign to attack the concept of the family. Before we do that, though, I thought a good place to start the conversation would be to talk about something that happened here in the state where I'm located, Virginia, because one county in particular, Loudoun County, really became a flashpoint for tension between parents and public schools, which I think really is a topic that you're heavily involved in. I think this all came about, it was kind of a silver lining to the forced remote learning. Parents could see what their children were learning because they're, watching on the computer, and they're really upset about a lot of stuff. I mean, I have a whole list. First of all, critical race theory being taught in the classroom. And I know this is a term that perhaps people who are more right of center automatically understand as a negative thing. I think a lot of people still think that critical race theory means teaching racism in America's history. It's really not. It's definitely a Marxist theory of race, and it teaches that white children are oppressors and everyone else is a oppressed victim. So parents, like Black and white, they were complaining at school board meetings about that. Another issue they were really upset about, high school students were being assigned reading assignments that were pretty much pornography. I mean, one parent read an excerpt at a school board meeting, and I think the exact phrase that he said, like, if this was read, or if this language was said in an office, it would be considered a hostile work environment. So right, and so critical race theory, the pornography, and a really awful situation that happened last year in Loudoun County. A superintendent covered up a sexual assault that occurred in a public high school. A boy allegedly wearing a skirt, I guess he identifies as a trans woman, he entered a girl's bathroom and sexually assaulted a female 9th grader. Actually, the lawyer of the family said the boy was charged with 2 counts of forcible sodomy. So it wasn't just sexual assault. It was 2 very graphic things. The father of the girl expressed his outrage at a school board meeting. He was arrested for it. I guess it was causing a disturbance. I saw the video. It was absurd that he was arrested. The National School Board Association, they used the situation to write a letter to the Biden administration saying that we need to crack down on these parents because they're domestic terrorists. And Attorney General Merrick Garland used that as a pretense to direct the FBI to use its authority against parents. And then finally, it all kind of culminated with the gubernatorial race. Democrat candidate Terry McAuliffe said he does not think parents should tell schools what to teach their children. And I think parents were so fed up with this that even though Virginia is a fairly blue state now, they elected Glenn Youngkin. So there's a lot going on last year in Loudoun County. So I guess my first question to you is, do parents have the right to tell schools what to teach their children?
Well, you've opened up a huge can of worms, right, with all of these issues that we've seen over the past year that have basically exploded and brought this issue, to the forefront. And so it's a crucial question. Do parents have the right to be involved in the education of their children? The answer, of course, is yes. Ask almost any parent, and they will say yes. They want to not only know what their child is being taught, but to have a say in what curriculum is taught, the way it's taught, and etc. So of course I do, and as you pointed out, even in your blue state, the parents have risen to the occasion to make that viewpoint known. That no, it isn't the school's prerogative to teach whatever they want, whenever they want, in whatever the way they want. No, the parents are inherently the first ones responsible for the education of the child. And ironically, that's even a tenet of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says the parents have a prior right to decide on the education of their children.
Mm-hmm. That declaration, was that formulated by the United Nations?
Yes, 1948, I believe. So it's been around a long time, and so it's interesting now that this issue is becoming so combative. I wish it weren't combative, but really, it's an issue worth fighting for, at least advocating for.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell me a little bit about the content that is being crept into these curriculums. Like, why is it so different from years past? What has changed, and what exactly is in this content?
Well, it's interesting when, well, as you mentioned in my book, there's a lot of information about this issue in the book. And I want to just, one thing that it's interesting, in 2018, the
Mhm.
Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development um, put out a document. And in the document, it said, children entering school in 2018 will need to value common prosperity, sustainability, and well-being above other concerns, and that curricula should continue to evolve, perhaps in radical ways
Mm.
that reflect evolving societal requirements. So even just a few years ago, they were saying outright that they wanted to, the global forces behind education were saying that they wanted to see radical changes in education curriculum. And surprise, surprise, here we are in, 2020 plus,
Yeah.
with very radical, kind of unimaginable things happening in the schools that we couldn't have foreseen even just a few years ago. So, environmentalism, there's three things that they list specifically in that same document, the OECD. They list environmentalism, a quite radical form of that, economic change requiring new social and economic models.
Mm-hmm.
What could that mean? If our current economic model is basically capitalism. So if they're advocating that we need to embrace new economic models, most of us understand that they're talking about socialism, socialistic ideas, and a controlled economy. And then also they advocate for social evolution arising from cultural diversity. And in most cases, which diversity is actually a great thing that we all, are striving for on a certain level. But the way that term is used is often meant to reflect sexual diversity, and in turn then teaching children very sexual content, sexual diversity, and exposing even very young children to sexual diversity, which most parents would not approve of.
Right. Now, sexual diversity, that's like gender ideology and like a trans ideology as well. Is that what you mean?
That's part of what I mean. Yeah. That is, there's a basic system for teaching sex education that has developed, and just so you know, I personally and the organization I work with are not opposed to general sex education in a general form,
Mm-hmm.
but the recent and most potent version of that is called comprehensive sexuality education,
Yeah.
and it's actually getting worse by the year. Oh gosh, I wish I had a quote for you here, but I know I do. Um, a lot of people don't realize just how bad it is. They think, well, sex education, that's probably pretty good. But let me read you one quote from a UN document
Sure.
promoting CSE, or comprehensive sexuality education. It says sexuality and sexual pleasure are important parts of being human for everyone, no matter what age, no matter if you're married or not, and no matter if you want to have children or not. And then it goes on from there. So the basic core ideology that's being taught is that sexual pleasure in whatever form is a human right,
Mm-hmm.
even for children. And so then if you believe that, and if you take that route, that stance,
Yeah.
then almost anything goes with teaching children how to gain sexual pleasure in whatever way. Really, the only limit to that I've seen in the curriculum is consent. But that's just not good enough for our children.
Yeah. You said this is the OECD document?
That one was from the Exclaim document published by International Planned Parenthood Federation, which works closely with the OECD
Right.
and the
So,
United Nations.
okay. All right. So when Planned Parenthood International says comprehensive sexual what's the full term?
Comprehensive sexuality education.
Okay, sexuality education. And they say that there's no age limit. Are they saying that children should have the right to have sex with children, or are they saying adults should have the right to have sex with children?
Well, that's the question. And they kind of beat around the bush, except that they don't, because the full name of the document is Explain Young People's Guide to Sexual Rights. And we know that at least in some UN documents and other Planned Parenthood documents, they define youth as 10-year-old and up. And also, in the quote I read, it said, no matter what age. So that leaves the barn doors wide open.
Right.
So, they're hesitant to say they're talking about babies or preschoolers, but are they? We'll see.
Right. Now, so both the OECD and the UN are obviously international organizations. So where have they succeeded in implementing this type of this vision statement?
Well, there's a whole big chapter on my book and just on that particular issue of how these kinds of sexuality education programs, and really not just sexuality education, but pro-socialism programs are being promoted and pushed. And it's not a secret. I mean, and a document in the book, the current Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, right now, he was previously in the early 2000s the president of Socialist International. So there's many of the other leaders of the UNESCO, recent leader of UNESCO, and other major UN entities are led by people who are openly socialist. And so, of course, the trickle down is going to be significant. And I lay out in the book, it's a little too complicated to go into all the details here, but it starts at the top with UN agencies and the Sustainable Development Goals, which sustainable development goals on some level are noble goals. But the question is, how are we going to work to accomplish them? How are we going to work towards eradicating hunger and so forth? Are we going to do it in a globally socialistic way? Or are we going to let nations and families have the greatest degree of freedom to meet their own needs as they can? And so just to give you the rough outline, so there's the UN agencies, then there's the Sustainable Development Goals. The OECD plays a huge role in student assessment and pushing all these kinds of programs that are socialistic in nature and sexual in nature. And then from there, there's the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning, as well as a document called the Incheon Declaration. So I'm just throwing that out there, and you can learn more in the book, but just to show you that there's a direct line that going down from the United Nations to the classroom. So then after the acronym is CASTLE, and after all those programs come down, they come right to your local classroom. And the threads are kind of obscured, and they try to not make that known. And when new programs come to school, it's almost always couched in a pilot program and with local people behind it and so forth. But it's really a setup. It's a global push for these things. It's not like the parents in my city have been campaigning for global equality and for these issues to be taught in our schools.
Right. It's not grassroots at all, but it's packaged in that way.
Yeah.
So I am terribly ignorant about how the UN is structured. So how is the Secretary General even appointed, elected? How much say does the individual countries and their representatives have in these appointments?
Well, they are appointed, and it's not exactly an election. And so there's a bit of, kind of positioning for power that takes place. And there's, the Secretary General isn't the only position of power. Of course, he's the most visible leader, but there's so many posts. I mean, myself I get lost in the organization of the United Nations and all the acronyms and all the things, because it is a huge behemoth of an organization that really wants to have control over most of the operating systems of the world. And so how a person rises to the top, it's an interesting question to look into as far as who appoints and how the countries are involved. So
right. I think I once had it explained to me thusly. There's supra national organizations, and I think the UN is an example. There's
Mhm.
transnational organizations, and I think like NATO would be one of them. The difference being that um, transnational, it's, and I hope I'm not confusing these two terms, but I think transnational, it's more just a loose alliance, and whereas organizational, it's an actual entity that's not beholden to any of the constituent members. It acts somewhat independently, but it's a bureaucracy that can um, have enormous sway in determining policies within the member nations. Is that correct?
It generally, yes. And so, and the idea behind the United Nations, again, is noble, that all the nations of the world come together and talk and cooperate. But through the decades since its inception, it's become more and more, as you say, not a grassroots, not a nations coming together, but pressure from the top down and pressuring developing nations and so forth. So
Right.
what started as what could have been in many ways a good idea has unfortunately been in many ways corrupted.
Right. And Kimberly, that's kind of gets to the crux of why I kind of started this project. I've been noticing
Mhm.
so many large institutions that have lost the trust of so many people. Perhaps they started with like neutral or perhaps benign intent, but they've been infiltrated by people with a very aggressive ideology. It doesn't represent the vast majority of people, and
Mhm.
they're making so it's become a vector, like anything large enough to uh, uh, exert control over a large amount of people. um it is like the target for, like, I think it's like the progressive leftist project. And so that's, they can control a lot of populations by controlling a very small amount of levers to pull, I guess is the term. And and I say leftism because, like, what else is the common thread between perhaps socialism and like a very radical sexual ideology, right?
Yeah, well, the picture I paint in my book is that the common tie between socialistic systems and a radical sexual ideology is destruction of the family.
Hmm.
And then also the third major entity that contributes to family deterioration, unfortunately, is radical feminism. And when I speak of feminism, I'm talking about the radical form of, not, most of us believe that women getting the vote was a great thing, women wearing pants and going to college. That's not the kind of feminism I'm talking about.
Right.
There's a
Yeah.
much more radical version of feminism that is anti-family, anti-man, and anti-child. And it's very concerning. And so those three kind of entities or movements, socialist, radical feminist, and sexual activism, are all, what they all have in common is destruction of the family.
Mm,
And that's the picture I paint in the book.
right. Okay. So let's kind of dig into that, the destruction of the family. Like, why
Mhm.
the family unit, and how are they doing this?
Why is the family under attack?
Hmm.
Well, that's the focus of the attack, because the family has power. In fact, the family has great power, and it has inherent power, because if you think about it, the family predates the state. Um, no one other than God had to organize the family with,
Right.
every other entity, a government, a program, anything is created post family. So the family is inherent, and it's self-regenerating, right? A man and a woman come together and they can produce a child, and that is family. And then it goes on from there, recreating itself without law, without anything. No king has to tell them that this can happen. It's just what happens because
Hmm.
of an anatomy. So, but beyond that, totalitarians want to usurp the power that the family has, because you think about it, well, for instance, Hitler famously said, "He who gains the youth gains the future."
Hmm.
And we know this, right? If you're going to truly affect the future in a long-lasting way, you have to get the minds of the young. Well, where are the young people of the world? They're in their families. They're in their families. And inside their families, in that private little sphere, moms and dads are teaching their children whatever they want, whatever they think is right and good and true. And so that's a huge obstacle for these global forces that who have their eyes on globalism and global control and global systems and socialism and trying to manage what everyone does, because the parents are teaching the children their first life lessons. And when children are taught something when they're very young, it's very hard to undo that. I mean, it can be done, but it's difficult. And so the family is the great obstacle to socialist success because it's inherently private. The other piece of that puzzle is that, well, why is it inherently private? Well, and I go into this in great deal in the book, but just a brief overview. When a mother gives birth to a baby, it's hers. It's hers. It belongs to her, right? How do we know that? Because it comes out of her body. It's connected to her by a cord. It is hers. And almost no one would argue that it doesn't belong to her. Now, she doesn't own it. That's a different thing. That's not what I'm saying. But it is hers. And she has both the privilege to raise that child and the opportunity to do it and the responsibility to do it. And then secondarily, in tandem, of course, with the woman is the man, or should be the man, the father. And the baby also belongs to the man. And so the man and the woman together, they are the stewards. They're the people who are biologically selected to help every new person and to teach every new person that arrives on earth. And so the family is really difficult to crush. And it's very difficult for the state to fully crush it. Even in, China and Russia, the family has not been crushed. It's been severely hurt and restrained and so forth. But really, it's ironic because the governments of the world stand on the strength of families. And so to try to crush the family, that's just cutting off the branch that you're sitting on. So their grand plans for destroying the family are not going to work, but they don't realize that. There's one thing, there was a radical feminist in the 70s, and her thoughts were really formative, foundational rather, to the modern feminist script. And she said that she acknowledged that past socialist societies had failed and collapsed. And she said that was because, quote, of their failure to sever the umbilical cord time connection between women and children, meaning babies still belong to their moms, meaning that's a private institution. There's private belonging because, of course, socialism doesn't want private belonging, doesn't want to allow private ownership. But possessorship always exists with a mother and a baby in a family. And so that's why the family is kind of like the tripwire for the giant ogre of globalist control. That's how I think of it. And so that's why they want to crush the family, is because it has power, and families control the minds of the youth, the children of them.
And that's why all these policies that, like, perhaps the Loudon parents, what parents across America and probably the world are objecting to, it's all these little ways to kind of put a barrier between parent and child, and interrupt that transmission of values from the parent to the child, because they envy it as a rival for whatever agenda they're trying to push.
Exactly. Exactly right.
What exactly is the end game? So when these people in these power nodes, they carry around this leftist ideology, what are they striving to? What do they want to see, like, when they're finished?
Well, I mean, if you want to just dive to the heart of it, Vladimir Lenin said, "Give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted." And along with what Hitler said about he who gains the youth gains the future, what their end game really is to claim stewardship over the children of the earth. That is it. They're trying to get the minds of the children and teach them what they want them to believe. And one tactic for doing this is to convince parents, especially mothers, and all of society, that children don't need their mothers and fathers, that's a secondary concern in life, that really what the main concern in life is work in the public sphere for money. And that's, that has been a really effective argument, because the argument has been framed from the socialist view that, oh, poor mothers, they have to work for free. Well, you can look at that two ways. They get to have stewardship over their children, and they get to control and shape the destiny of the world by teaching all of the children in it. And so to say that, so Mao, for instance, he took the bait, hook, line, and sinker, the socialist line that for work to be socially productive, that it needs to happen in the public sphere for
Mm,
money. Well, that totally negates and undercuts the work that is done by mothers and fathers in their families, which I would argue is the most significant work that goes on in the world. It has to be both sides, right? There has to be the private family life, and there has to be a public life, to one to support the other. You can't really have one without the other, so they work together. But Mao basically said we need to arouse women and get them into productive activity, as if raising humanity is not socially productive activity.
right.
And because it is. What if we don't have mothers and fathers instilling basic just skills and emotional abilities and basic morals in people? The world will fall apart, and so to say that the work that's done in families is not socially productive, that's just completely untrue. And but a lot of the radical feminist people of the world have fallen for that and saying, oh yeah, the work that I do in my home isn't socially productive, I've got to do something different, or you know what I mean. And so our whole society by and large has gone in that direction, if not anti-family, at least away from family. And on the global level, it is becoming more and more rapidly anti-family. And now, don't get me wrong, it's not that women can't work outside the home. I
No,
do work other than my mothering work, but it's the valuing of parental work that we need to return to.
right. And also this idea that productive work must be like some sort of social, like in the public, creating something outside of the home. It's almost like, what is all this economic activity for? There's like no enjoyment of the fruits of labor. What are the best moments in life? It's like celebrating with family, with friends.
Exactly. What we so often don't acknowledge is that the private sphere, the family sphere, is the more treasured sphere of
Yes.
the two. And the reason why most of us go out and work during the day is so we can come home and be home
Yeah.
with the people we love. That's why we work. There's other motivations as well, but that's why we do what we do, is because we treasure the home. We
Yeah.
treasure the private sphere.
And it's funny because like you watch all these like productivity gurus or like wealth management advisors, like one of the things they always say when they're talking about what to aim for in a successful life is, when you're on your deathbed, you're not going to say to yourself, oh, I wish I had worked more hours, or I wish I had, earned more. They're always like, no, you wish you had spent more meaningful moments with loved ones.
Right.
So
Yeah,
even like,
no, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, and it is funny that you said how the feminist agenda has kind of, not the feminist agenda, like the current wave of feminism as it's understood, like a woman has to be financially independent, and family is an impediment to that independence.
Mhm.
It's kind of it's in sync, it's synoptic with this idea of state production above all.
Mhm.
So it's like the Venn diagram. Like I see how those three legs of the stool, how they all overlap into like to this Venn diagram. um
Mhm.
and anything outside of where those three circles overlap, that's discarded by these people who are now in power in the UN,
Mhm.
OECD, and how it's
Right.
trickling down to like local levels.
Yeah, and you asked before, so okay, so that what is their end game and how are they enacting it? So the end game is to get the minds of the children, in essence. And the best way to do that, the most effective way to do that currently, is through schools, because the home still is, to a very large degree, impenetrable. You know, um, we don't have government people coming into our homes giving nightly lessons to our children. Let's hope and pray that it never comes to that, but
Right.
that's not where we are. Thank heavens. And so the best way to get the minds of the children is through the schools, expanding school hours. We're trying to get children at younger and younger levels, and that is a global push. And I explain that and I show that in my book. But just like, for instance, there's a Russian communist that explained that he said children, like soft wax, are very malleable and they should be molded into good communists. And how do we do that? He says, from the earliest days of their little lives, they must find themselves under the influence of communist schools. To oblige the mother to give her child to the Soviet state, that is our task. And that really sums it up. I mean, we're saying we want to take the child from the mother. And the way we're going to do that is through schools. And so this, we see this kind of voracious push to infiltrate the schools, to take control of school curriculum, to shut parents out, to tell parents, that they don't have a right to decide what their child is going to hear and be taught. And so it's actually quite effective, because if a child is at school 6 to 8 hours a day, hearing all these kind of things, you can fortify your child against it. And there's actually a really inspiring story in my book about that everyone should read. If you only read chapter 22, it's worth the read.
Mhm.
But so we can, but it's difficult for a child because they are malleable. And so if they're taught at home, for a couple hours of the day, but they're taught very different things in school all day long, that is difficult for a child to make sense of that. And it is difficult for family values, as you said, to be passed down, from one generation to another. We have to do it, and we can do it. I think we're up to the task, but the state sees their goal very clearly and are working toward it. Not I'm not saying all government officials and all schools, and certainly not all teachers. My children have had wonderful teachers through the years and so forth. I don't want to sound like I'm condemning the whole education system, because there are good people trying to do good things. But unfortunately, as I show in the book, the whole system from the top down has been infected in problematic ways.
Right. And that infection, like this very particularly ideological socialist education, it's well funded, and that's what's becoming the norm, or what's being pushed as the norm in public schools. And so a well-meaning teacher may not know the difference between like a genuinely good curriculum and one that has been infected with the socialist ideology. Is that right? They might defend it as beneficial for children.
Right. Yeah. And they may not even be aware at first. And we'll see. I think that a clash between really good-hearted teachers and those pushing the curriculum is coming, because I think a lot of good teachers, when they see especially the sexual content of some of these programs, as well as the blatantly socialist things, I don't think they're going to go there. I think they're going to refuse to do that. And hopefully, so then the problem is that then the teaching posts will all be taken by people who are on board with this kind of teaching. But the flip side of that, which I hope will emerge, is that, and we've already seen this happening because of in connection with COVID, that people and parents will begin to consider other educational options. That for so long it's just been the state-run school, but there's a huge array of other options that are available that we can pursue. And I hope that we have a renaissance, if you will, of educational options and kind of pursuits, both with people providing either schools or mentoring or whatever it might be, as well as parents really taking the reins of their children's education.
Absolutely. I think lockdown actually helped put some juice into that movement. A lot of parents so, okay, well, if the public school isn't going to do in-person classes, then I'm going to supplement the current education that they're getting, which is very minimal, with I think they called them pods. Like they'd get a few kids from the neighborhood together, and like they'd pool their money for like one tutor to teach them stuff, or they were bringing them into private schools or homeschooling. I mean, a renaissance of rethinking the education paradigm would be wonderful.
And I think that's happening.
That's good. And going back to the comprehensive sexualized education, it's so shocking. I think pedophilia is still one of the things in America that's still widely rejected. So it almost seems like, the UN, they're overplaying their hand, not the UN, but this leftist contingent in the UN. Did they bring this out a little too early? Like, will that be what makes people wake up and say, well, the whole agenda itself is toxic? Do you have any hope for that?
Yes, I do. And I believe that will happen. And I think they have. When people see what's in the curriculum and the ideology behind it, when parents see it, they are repulsed. And so, yes, I think the power of parents and the power of the family will topple what they're trying to do. I think they've underestimated the power of parents and what parents are willing to do to protect their children. And also, when you teach untruth, it eventually buckles. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of heartache and tragedy in the meantime of, for instance, trying to enact global socialism. It's going to be a huge catastrophe. So it will fall on its face, and trying to push children's sexual rights, that's not a winning model. That's not a winning position. And so I hope and I think that families will win out in that battle. But we do have to stand up. We do have to take a stand for our children and be in charge of their education and be involved and ask for change and be part of the change that we want to see.
Mm-hmm. So you and I, before we started recording, we had spoken about this new thing that you're researching, community schools. That's a new like strategy that's being, well, I don't know if it's new, but we're seeing it at a state level. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, and this is a fairly new area for me too, but it
Okay.
isn't a new movement. How we talked before about how the communist I quoted saying that it's through the schools that we're going to get the children. Well, there's other documentation. Of course, we all know, on the socialist, the communist countries, Russia and so forth, that their goal was to have full service schools. So you take the child to the school and there's everything they need there. There's free meals, there's free health care. It's a one-stop shop. And that is the movement. And even just very recently, there's a renewed call for that in some states in the nation. And it sounds very nice, and parts of it might actually be helpful, but the move towards full service schools, in my opinion, is very dangerous because it, again, is out to undercut the influence of family and emphasize the power of the school and cooperating entities. So, we don't want our schools, most people don't want our schools to be full care centers for our children, to provide all of their physical and emotional and even spiritual needs, they say in some of the documentation. And that's not the place of a school.
Right. It would be a replacement for the home.
Yes, and even Arnie Duncan, he was in the Obama administration over education, and in 2009 he said that he wanted to see the community school be the heart of the family.
The heart.
Then that's just absurd. I mean, that's so kind of repulsive to me, and I think to most parents. The home is the heart of the family,
Right.
not the school. Not the school.
So children would spend the entire day there, or would it be
Yes.
like yeah.
Before school programs, after school programs, any sort of program. And they start with pilot programs and try to make it sound good, but it's just inching closer to, the communist model of full service schools where your child is taught what the government wants them to know.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's
it's an easy sell for parents who want to focus on careers or just don't like parenting. They'd probably be
right, or for people who are in a tough situation. I mean, let's face it, we've kind of moved ourselves, unfortunately, in a direction where it's difficult for a family to prioritize parenting and earn a living. And so I think that's something that we need to really work hard at changing.
Yeah. I mean, I think the solutions there would be either help people with that, like help people flourish and prosper on their own, or I don't know. I mean, do we expect people to earn too much just to stay afloat? Like I don't know. It seems like people are on a treadmill that you have to run just to stay in one spot. And
right, and we need to rethink those things. And inflation isn't helping, and there's so many things that aren't helping. High taxes aren't helping.
Yeah.
If families could keep most of their earned income and apply it in the ways that are best for their family, both education wise and otherwise, that would be a huge step.
Right. So Family Watch International, that's the organization you're involved with.
Mhm.
So is this, and are there other groups that are kind of like watchdogs that are keeping an eye on these types of things that are coming from these international organizations?
Yes, Family Watch International has been around since about 1999, and I've been on board for about 8 or 9 years. But definitely a kind of a watchdog for these things at the global level, fighting for the family at the United Nations, advocating for family-friendly policy, and
Mhm.
so forth. But there are many other really high-quality organizations. There's a Catholic organization called CFAM, United Families International, and many others. Um, who kind of keep an eye on things at the global level and as well locally as well.
Right. So if a parent saw this interview we did and their children are in public schools, like what would you suggest? Like where can they turn to learn what exactly is being taught and to cross-examine it with what's being coming out of their school, their children's school?
Right, because that's, I think, is where we actually can make quite a difference, is in
Mhm.
our local school, in your community. So be involved at your school, go to school board meetings, know what decisions are being made. For instance, in my state, there's the state school board is deliberating this week on the gender identity and sexual orientation procedures for schools. Make comments, know what's going on. There's a wonderful website you can go to learn specifically about comprehensive sexuality education, and that's stopcse.org. Stopcse.org. There's a wealth of information on there. There's a really great 10-minute documentary and a longer version as well that will kind of open people's eyes to what the agenda is and what is already happening in schools, and so that you can be on guard for those things and make sure that they're not entering into your school, and if they do, work to get them out. There's also a host of information on at familywatch.org, a lot of videos, a lot of policy briefs that will help people get a grip on what's happening and how to make change.
Awesome. Kimberly, I mean, it's a disturbing subject, but I'm so glad that you and your colleagues are working on it. So thank you so much. And before we finish, like any closing thoughts on what parents can do to protect their children, seeing that these types of ideas are being normalized so rapidly?
Yeah, first of all, a little more broadly, I mean, the end game that I would like to see, that I think most parents would want to see, is that we would have governments of nations protecting the God-given rights of individuals and families,
Yeah.
right? Our freedom of speech and freedom of religion, parental rights, property ownership, that has to be in place. Those things exist to protect people and families. So we need our government to return to doing those kinds of things rather than a million other things that they're currently doing. And as we talked about, education needs to come under local control. We need to return to that model. And it took me a long time to come to this, Christian, but I really believe we need to unplug from all federal monies. There needs to not be a federal education system because it doesn't work well. And parents lose control.
Mhm.
Control needs to be local. Education does not have to be a government funded, government driven, government run endeavor. That's a socialistic approach to education. And while that might work in some levels and in some situations, what we need is local control and local transparency. Because government run education has been, for the most part, an epic failure. If you look at the literacy of basic people during the founding fathers era and today, not to mention the moral fabric of the people, there has been decay despite the billions of dollars that have been spent. So that should cause us to look at the system and reconsider. Um, and then the other things, we need to return to a family-centric culture. And this isn't going to happen necessarily by edicts or laws. People have to choose it. They have to
Mhm.
choose to prioritize marriage and family, and and talk about that sex should happen within marriage. That's where it's meant to happen, not outside of marriage. And we need to foster a culture where motherhood is valued and fatherhood is valued as socially productive work.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting a return to like the 50s or ancient times where it's such strict gender issues. I think we've come a very long way for good reasons, but
Yeah.
I still think the best is yet to come, and I think we're still trying to figure out where, I think the pendulum of men's and women's roles has swung and back and forth. And I don't think we have found quite the right way that God intended yet, but I think we're going to get there. And so, so what can parents do? You ask. There's a whole list at the end of my book. I'll show you the book here.
Yeah, let's see it.
The Invincible Family.
Can you pull it back a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah, there we go. That's good.
There we go.
The Invincible Family.
Yeah, so there's many things. First of all, first and foremost, above all else, teach your children in your home what you believe, or your grandchildren, what you believe about marriage, family, sex, and gender.
Yeah.
And do it consistently and do it positively. There's so many opportunities to do this, and we have to do it, because if our children will hear the other side a lot, and they need to hear the truth from us, consistently and with love. And so another valuable thing is to get and read great books, both fiction and nonfiction, because there's a whole world that our children could absorb from books. Learning the history of socialism through books, it becomes obvious it's a total disaster, right? Mm-hmm. Learning about the origins of our freedoms in our country in books. So that may seem elementary, but getting and reading great books with our children is essential. And then I think each person can be guided of, what do you see in your neighborhood, in your community, that needs fixing or doing? Where do you see people are confused about an issue? Is there something you can do about that? Can you start a neighborhood talk group or book club, or mother support group? And like the options are endless, and there's a lot of millions of us out there that have something to contribute, and everyone does. Of course, we need to expose the hideous roots of comprehensive sexuality education, learning about it ourselves, sharing the documentary I mentioned at stopcsc.org. I'd highly recommend that. Mm-hmm. And then working to support a family-friendly culture where our young sons and daughters are taught, first of all, that they are sons and daughters, and that becoming a parent is a wonderful life goal, and that becoming a mother or father is not a waste of life. In fact, it's the very best part of life. It's why the rest of life exists, really. And so I think the name of my book is The Invincible Family, and that's on purpose, because it's very positive, because the family is invincible. It just will always keep coming back, as long as men and women get together and marry and have children, the family will exist. And even if, all of our worst fears come true, and there's government oppression and global entities ruling over our lives and all that, the family will still be private, and it will still have power. And you know what? By the smallest of things, great things can happen. And I believe the family is going to, in the end, wield more power than all of these other concerning things we've talked about. And the love of mothers and fathers is stronger than all of that. It's stronger than anything else. And so, a bit like a phoenix rising from the ashes of society, the family will always come back, and it will always triumph, and people will return to it.
Holy moly. So those were not closing arguments. Do you have time? Can I ask you something about what you just said?
Sure.
You don't have like a hard stop at like an hour or anything, do you?
We're fine.
All right. So let's go back to the beginning. You said federal funding for local schools. So that would mean either eliminating the Department of Education, or perhaps like demoting it to like a sub cabinet entity. Do you think that's like feasible? Is that something that could ever happen in our lifetime?
I don't know. And it seems radical, like, what? We're gonna not have our federal education system? Well, I think
we did for not hundreds, but like many decades.
We did, and we can do it again. And guess what? We can do it better. So I don't know. It's very hard to sell. A lot of politicians are afraid to go that far. But I think when we see the decadent state and where it is heading, I hope that we'll be wise enough to make other choices.
Mm-hmm. And
or if it's not obliterated, that we just don't participate in it.
Right. And
as long as that remains legal.
And parents would have the ability to do that if there was like more like state level school choice options? Is that
Yeah,
it?
there's a million things. I think there's probably a lot of things we haven't even thought of yet. I'm not necessarily advocating just for homeschool, but there's a lot of different types of homeschools that are options and co-ops. I know a lot of different people just in my state who have some very creative education options that are flexible and really enriching and just turn out the best kids, you
Hmm.
know, and if we had the money that were the billions of dollars we're shuttling to the federal education system, if we had that in our communities, we could make community schools, you know, or even the idea of mentorship or apprenticeship.
Yes.
There's so many paths to success, and it doesn't necessarily have to go through college. I went through college. My girls are in college now. I've generally been in favor of college, but you know what? That doesn't have to be the way for everybody.
Right.
There's millions of people and millions of options that can work. And so I think as we just begin to even think in different ways, new ideas will come to our minds, and we can cooperate to create the education for our children that we want.
YouTube has been revolutionary for people teaching other people really valuable skills. Um,
Mhm.
it's I love the internet. I know big tech firms are uh, people in the conservative movement are rightfully a little concerned about censorship and all that, but
Sure.
YouTube, if used correctly, is just an outstanding tool. Um,
That's how my husband fixes everything. You just Google
yeah,
it and YouTube it and you get a tutorial, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, like, so what is education now? But you show up to get some sort of credential, and a lot of the information that you're getting, you have the benefit of having like somebody, face to face transmitting this information, but a lot of that can be done for free, extracted from these videos. And even this idea that it doesn't have to be YouTube, but the best teacher in the world could teach millions of students, whereas
Mhm,
right now we kind of have like one teacher teach maybe 20 at a time, and that
mhm.
teacher may or may not have like the skills or passion to really impart that knowledge in a way that students would absorb.
Mhm. Right. And see, it's ironic, right? Because what we're on one hand, we're saying smaller local control, but what you just suggested was an option where one teacher can teach millions. That's great. That's okay. That's a revolutionary idea. As
Mm,
long as it's not a forced,
right.
programmed agenda, that's a great option.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it could be like a supplement to, like, let's say a pod, like, hey, the kids on the block, they get together at such and such a time, like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and they watch these tutorials about algebra. And then the rest of the day, they're pursuing like other educational pursuits. It can be highly customized. It doesn't have to be like the paradigm that we've had for, many, many years.
Right, 6 to 8 hours a day for 12 years of a child's life. And I really do think that, again, that comes back to the family, because children now spend so much time outside the family realm. They more and more take their moral cues from their peers
Yeah.
and others rather than their parents and family. And so I think that's a huge contributor to the moral decay that we've experienced.
Hmm. And you talked about this idea of uh, reinstilling, or even I think like just rethinking the culture of a family, like a man and
Mhm,
wife's role of raising children. And you mentioned like perhaps in the 50s, or even in biblical times, like we have this idea that a family life was actually quite severe. It
mhm,
was particularly severe for perhaps the wife or even children, especially if the man of the house was not a kindly figure.
mhm,
I guess we get this idea of like toxic masculinity or tyrannical patriarchy from these stories of like abusive father figures. And fair enough in many cases, but like you said, like we haven't, the pendulum hasn't been calibrated yet, so it's like God's plan of what the family on earth could be. Uh,
mhm,
so I think that's really interesting. I think people are really searching for what that balance looks like. Um,
mhm.
I think it's less radical now to accept that idea. I think there's a lot of communities online who kind
Mhm.
of yearn for that, and they're not afraid to say it, and they're young people too.
Mhm. I think you're right. And again, people are eventually, there's so much concern about the rising generation, but I have great hope because I
Yeah.
think people, as we destroy the family more and more, people will yearn for it more and more because it'll be
Hmm.
what's missing. And I think they'll return to it and realize that they want the cooperation of a family, of a spouse, the support, the appreciation, the cooperation that should exist between the sexes. We shouldn't be competing with each other as men and women. We're meant to cooperate and to complement each other. And if we can stop competing and start cooperating more, and not that that's easy, I'm not saying that's an easy task, but it's a task that's worth doing, and it's best accomplished in a committed family situation.
Hmm. And here's a question. It's kind of, I suppose, related to how we kind of um, calibrate like a better culture of family.
Mhm.
Do you know? I think she's a professor, Camilla Paglia.
I've read some of her material.
Oh, really? Yeah, I think
Mhm.
she was talking to another professor who I'm a big fan of, Jordan Peterson. They're having a
Mhm.
conversation about the family unit, and she even thought that like the idea of a nuclear family, like husband, wife, children, all in one house, and you're kind of isolated, and you're perhaps on a suburban block, and this is your kind of this is your life. She didn't necessarily think that was ideal either. She was comparing it to like perhaps an Italian household where there's like multiple generations all in one house, and like children are half raised by their cousins and aunts, and
Mhm.
like I just thinking of different modes of living where there is you know blood ties and things like that. Any idea about any
Mhm.
thoughts on that?
Well, the great thing is no one has to tell us how it needs to look for us. Every family can be quite different in the
Yeah.
way they work out all of those things. And of course, the support of a peripheral family and multi-generational families is important and helpful, and families have moved farther and farther apart, which has strained, I think, the core family and in some ways. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's we don't need to be told, oh, this is how it's exactly going to be, and the woman needs to do this and the man, no, that can be worked out marriage by marriage. And there's so many options for both women and men, both to earn money and to invest time in their families, that like I've said, the options are limitless, and each
Hmm.
family can figure that out for themselves. We don't need the government managing what it means to have equality in the home and stuff. We don't need that. We can figure that out for ourselves, and we should.
Right. All right. Last question, and this is another culture related question.
Okay.
Let's say there's like a young adult, like a young lady or a young man who's kind of working through these problems himself or herself. Like, what is your advice
Mhm.
to a young lady who's marriage minded, or a young man who's also looking to settle down? What
Mhm.
what what advice would you give them?
Okay, well, first of all, and I don't know if this is what you're asking for, but the first thing that came to mind is, for heaven's sakes, don't have sex until you're married. Do not do it. This is
No, nobody's going to follow that unless they had some sort of religious upbringing. I think it's so hard for people to, or
yeah.
perhaps it's not as unusual as we're told from like media or entertainment, but that's
Mhm.
a tricky one.
Yeah, just that is the best advice. Women have been sold this line that somehow they're more free if they, have sex with multiple men who are not committed to them.
Yeah.
That does not free or empower women. It endangers them more. And it's the woman who is more at risk for sexual intercourse, both for disease. Women are more susceptible to disease and pregnancy, which is a huge issue. And even if a person believes in abortion, which I do not, um, abortion then presents risks to who? The woman, not the man, the woman. And so the when sex is seen as being a privilege of being married and something you wait for until you are married, that is the woman's kind of greatest leverage. And because, you know, then the man is going to commit. And
Yep.
so what needs to happen when a man and a woman are going to thinking about meshing their lives, there needs to be commitment, and it needs to be solid, because then once you create a child, that's forever. Like
Yeah.
once you have a child, even if a couple divorces, the child is not doesn't become not their child. And so, you know, sex outside of marriage just introduces so many problems, especially for women, but also for men, that need to be looked at. And we need to just stop listening to the, oh, that's just what people do, and this is what they always do in the movies, because no, it isn't. There's a way better model, and we can follow it. And I think a lot of girls would actually appreciate that. So anyways, I don't know if that was what you're trying to get at, but also to be mindful, to not just follow we need to be educated about these issues, gender issues. We need to figure out, as a young person, where do you stand on that? What are the issues? Explore both sides of the story, find out about that. Where do you stand on marriage? You know what I mean? And then seek people in places that are worthwhile to meet. You know, if young people are looking for high quality young people who might share similar values, think about where you're going to find people like that. Mm-hmm. It may not be at the local bar. You know what I'm saying? There might be better venues for meeting people, and finding a worthy mate that you are worthy of and they're worthy of you, is a worthwhile goal. Just marriage is worth committing to. And I realize it doesn't happen for everyone, and that's okay, and that's a reality. But prioritizing marriage should be important. It should be a life goal to marry and have children if that's possible for you. So those are the first things that come to mind. But and also not to give up on the world. I hear, you know, some people saying, oh, well, people don't want to have kids anymore because the world is so bad. Well, you know what makes the world better? Babies and families. And that's where it brings joy, and having good, strong families who have their morals in line and their heads on straight. That's what's going to make the world better. So we need to not be shy about, oh no, the world's too bad, I can't have kids. No, yes, you can, and your kids are going to make this world better, and so are you. And you'll be a better person for having had children and having that experience in most cases.
Yes. That's a beautiful place to end. Kimberly, thank you so much for all of this.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Absolutely. So once again, the title of your book is The Invincible Family: Why the Global Campaign to Crush Motherhood and Fatherhood Can't Win.
And you can find it at invinciblefamily.com.
Awesome.
And Amazon.
Very good. And if all of you like watching, if you like this video, like and subscribe. It helps, and share with anyone who might find it interesting. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Take care.